Today we're going to be talking about why exes come back when you least expect it. And I've talked a lot about this phenomenon in the past, but with this video I really thought it would be fun to dive into the psychology of what's going on here. Over the years, we've experienced this phenomenon where when you kind of move on and you're with someone else or you don't want your ex back anymore, all of a sudden they come back into the picture and want to rekindle things. And at first, when we heard about this phenomenon or experienced it, we didn't really know why. But over the years, we've picked up some tricks. We've learned a lot about the human psyche when it comes to breakups, and we feel like we have an answer. And really, it revolves around three core reasons. The first reason is your ex has an avoidant attachment style. The second reason is you've reprioritized them on your pedestal. And the third reason is you've been adopting more secure behaviors, and this has almost like this magnetism to it. So I'm not expecting you to be an expert in each of these reasons. That's what this video is for. So let's just jump right into it and talk about the major reasons for why exes seem to come back when you least expect it. So reason number one, they have an avoidant attachment style. So one of the first things that popped into my mind when faced with the question of why exes always seem to come back when you least expect it has to do with the dynamics of an avoidant attachment style. Now, our research has indicated that close to 70% of our clients' exes have this type of an attachment style. So what is an avoidant attachment style? Well, our very own coach Tyler, who I did an interview with a couple of weeks ago, defines an avoidant attachment style as this: a person that does not like a lot of emotional intimacy or vulnerability within a relationship. They typically revert a conversation back to someone else to talk about themselves to avoid the spotlight. Often that's how you'll figure out if they're an avoidant or not. Ultimately, they are afraid of having a deeper emotional connection, and it can all stem from their experience in childhood. They've learned that anytime they're vulnerable, it can be used against them, and therefore they don't rely on other people. So their big core wound is this understanding that they do not want to lose independence. They do not want to lose power over themselves, and being vulnerable in a relationship is a loss of that power. So the big thing you need to learn about avoidance, or the big takeaway, is they value independence and self-sufficiency above all. Of course, we also know from research that most of our clients fall into the anxious attachment category, which is at the other end of the spectrum from an avoidant. So when you get these two together, it's literally like fire melting ice, or it's kind of like this meeting of fire and ice. At first, the effect they create is very profound. Oftentimes, you'll talk to a pairing that is an avoidant person and an anxious person getting together, and they'll say, "This is the best I've ever felt in my life." But as time goes on, the anxious person's fire begins to erupt, the avoidant person's ice begins to melt, and the relationship gets ruined. So how is it that an avoidant attachment style has anything to do with an ex coming back when you least expect it? Well, one of the big things that our research yielded is something that I like to call the nostalgia factor. So when researching when avoidant exes tend to miss their exes, I learned that weirdly an avoidant usually only misses an ex after the fact. And if you understand their psychology, this actually makes sense. So the avoidant is almost always looking for a relationship that they can't have. It's why our concept of the ungettable girl is so profound for so many of our clients. They really want a relationship in which they can daydream about but not actually have to be vulnerable in. So usually they begin to have nostalgia about the good times of their relationship with you when they feel like you have moved on in two core ways. Number one is you've moved on to someone else. Number two is you haven't talked to them in months. Notice how I did not include you tried to win them back or you blew up their phone trying to get in touch. Really, for the avoidant, desire is created through space. Without it, they aren't going to miss you. So let's circle back to the original question. One of the reasons that I think exes seem to come back when you least expect it is because you're authentically going through the process of moving on, which allows your ex to have this nostalgia, and that's when they reach out. Of course, a few more important things usually need to unfold. And that's where reason number 2 comes into play. Real quick, I want to say that if you're new to this YouTube channel or you're trying to figure out what you should be doing to get your ex back and you're trying to learn if you even have a chance in your specific circumstance,
probably the smartest thing for you to do is actually stop by our website, www.exboyfriendrecovery.com, or take our X Recovery Chances quiz that can be found at exboyfriendrecovery.com. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, taking that free quiz is super easy to do. All you have to simply do is look in the description link below this YouTube video and click on the link you see there. It will take you directly to the quiz where you can fill it out and get an easy answer on what you should be doing going forward and overall what your chances look like in your specific situation. All right, so let's get you back to the video.
Reason number 2 is you've reprioritized them on your pedestal. So perhaps the greatest mistake that I see most of my clients make has to do with time management more than anything. Time is without a doubt our most precious resource, yet how many people waste it every day on things that they're not really happy about or that aren't going to give their lives meaning? A lot. And this is especially true after a breakup. Usually when a client comes into our orbit after their time, the breakup kind of looks something like this. They'll spend 70% of their time focusing on relationships, fixing the relationship, obsessing about exes, things like that. They'll spend 15% of their time on or energy worrying about work and wealth-based things, and then 15% of the time worried about health. So really within that time breakdown, it's very heavily dependent on relationships. They're gaining a lot of meaning through the relationships in their life, and that's not always a healthy thing. So when you actually look at the relationships portion. So I said 70% of time focused on relationships, 15% of time focused on health, 15% of time focused on wealth. But really when you look at the relationships portion, that 70% of the time, how are they spending that time focused on relationships? Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. The average breakdown for our client when they first come into our orbit looks something like this. 65% of their time is going to be focused on their ex, thinking about them, obsessing about them, stuff like that. 13% of the time is going to be focused on their family. 10% of the time is going to be focused on their friends. 7% of the time is going to be focused on their work colleagues. And then finally, 5% of the time focused on pets. So oftentimes the goal I set when people enter our orbit isn't to get them to forget about their ex, but to lower their overall time management so they aren't so relationship focused. Notice how I structure time management within the Holy Trinity concept: health, wealth, relationships. These are the things that matter after a breakup. Finding a time management balance so that your ex isn't your first priority anymore is key to basically having them look at you in an attractive way again. So something else is that in an ideal world, your balance would look something like this. So let's just take sort of the ideal balance of health, wealth, and relationships. You've heard me talk a lot about the Holy Trinity and the concept and why it's important, especially after a breakup and during the no contact rule. But what should the time management balance actually look like? So I decided to get really realistic with this because ideally you just have 33.3, 33.3, 33.3, and you'd have a perfect balance of the Holy Trinity. But that's just not feasible. There's only so much time you can spend on health, for example. You can only spend so much time working out, eating healthy, going to see therapists, like reading about it. You're not going to spend, 8 hours of your day focused on that. So inherently, the breakdown or the ideal breakdown you're shooting for should look something like this. 45% of your time should be focused on wealth. More on that in a second. 35% of the time should be focused on relationships, and 20% of the time should be focused on health. Couple of things to note. Notice how relationships still takes a huge portion of the overall time management chart. This is because realistically, you can't spend all of your time working out, eating healthy, going to therapy sessions. We talked about this already. But still, we've dropped our time focused in relationships down from 70% to 35%. That's a gigantic drop. But really taking its place in the brunt of your time management is the wealth category. But there's something very specific I want you to do within this category. In fact, if there's one thing you take away from this video, it's this. I want you to find your magnum opus. Basically, that thing in your life that gives you meaning. And I want you to begin taking steps towards making money with it. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but what it will do is kick your ex off the top of your pedestal. Instead, you'll be spending most of your time towards a pursuit which gives your life meaning and you could potentially earn some cash, which in turn just kind of like focuses and helps you feel happier, I guess. Now, we already know that avoidants are drawn towards self-sufficiency. So what we often see happens is when they sense that they are no longer your top priority in life, they begin to get interested in you again. And the irony is literally everything I just talked about is about displaying secure behaviors, which leads us to our final reason. Reason number 3. You've begun adopting more secure behaviors. First things first, what is a secure attachment style? According to the definitions, you're considered to have a secure attachment style if you're comfortable with intimacy. You're not worried about rejection, and you are confident that your significant other wants to be in the relationship with you. People with secure attachments often will handle breakups in very healthy ways, but there's usually one theme behind their approach. Everything they do post-breakup is meant to outgrow their ex, so they aren't reliant on the relationship anymore. The way I've always looked at secure attachments is that they are everything an avoidant and anxious attachment style would want. For the avoidant, they're not afraid to give them space when they sense them pulling away. For the anxious person, on the other hand, if they're in a relationship with an avoidant, they're terrified of doing that because they would feel like if they gave the avoidant space, they would leave them forever. When a secure gets into a relationship with an anxious attachment style, they aren't afraid to give that person emotional support during the moments where they feel paranoia. Yet, the interesting thing about a securely attached person is that they aren't afraid to set boundaries. They aren't the type of person that's going to allow an anxious person to get away with an insane amount of paranoia. They'll simply leave the relationship. They aren't the type of person that's always going to give an avoidant space all the time. Instead, they'll show them how to be vulnerable. In a way, the best description of a secure attachment is that they are essentially the North Star for all other insecure attachment styles, a constant presence showing them how relationships are supposed to be. This is something we've actually observed with our success stories. I often use the descriptor of gravity, almost like how planets revolve around the sun. So imagine for a moment you have sort of the secure attachment is a sun, and then you have these 3 other planets that are revolving around the sun: an anxious planet, an avoidant planet, and a fearful planet. Well, what happens is that when 2 of the planets, or when a planet gets sort of close to the sun kind of pulls it in. That secure gravity kind of pulls it in. And all of a sudden, the anxious, the avoidant, the fearful person begins to feel like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to operate in relationships. And that's great. But weirdly enough, the insecure attachment style, when they learn to become more secure, it's not an overnight process. And this is where people get tripped up a lot of time. They think all I need to be is secure, and all of a sudden, the anxious person, the avoidant person, the fearful person that I'm dating is going to start exhibiting more secure attachments and will live happily ever after. It's not an overnight process. It's never easy. There's setbacks. And oftentimes what happens is when a securely attached person can enter the orbit of an insecure person, the insecure person can impose their will and pull the securely attached person to them. So imagine for a moment that you have a secure attachment and you enter into a relationship with an anxious, an avoidant, or a fearful. A battle unfolds where your attachment gravity goes up against their insecure attachment gravity, and something is going to win out. And so what happens, and the important thing to realize about attachment styles is that they're all fluid. But what happens is whatever attachment style kind of wins out, the anxious or the secure or the avoidant or the secure or the fearful or the secure, one of those is going to win out. And the other attachment style that is the loser in that battle ends up exhibiting behaviors that are either secure or insecure based on which attachment style lost out. Most of the time, an interesting thing happens with our clients though. So our clients, we know from researching, close to 90% of them have anxious attachment behaviors. Some of them are avoidant, some of them are fearful, but most of the time they're anxious. And this almost gives them kind of the really unfair advantage when they're trying to get exes back or trying to move on from an ex. Most of the time when they come to us, they aren't secure. They're anxious. So in an odd way, this interesting advantage they have is as they begin to exhibit more secure attachment behaviors, it's such a jarring difference for their exes that their exes literally start to look at them like this new person. So sometimes the contrast in attachment behaviors is enough to win the attachment battle.